Okay, hello and welcome. In this tutorial, we are going to be creating glass using Redshift materials. And we're going to go over some of the settings in transparency, or sorry, transmission, that are going to determine how effectively we make something that's made of glass. In the second part of this tutorial, we're going to look at then how to make water inside a glass or wine inside a glass or whatever. In this case, we're using these wine glasses. Now, for those of you that are in the class, I already have this file on Canvas. You can download it and please start working from there. There's a few changes we need to make because this is from an older version. And so if you're not in the class, the biggest thing, and this is for everybody, even if you're in the class, it doesn't really matter. When you're working with glass, the objects need to be to scale, right? So if I select, my wine glass and go to coordinates, not coordinates, if I go, where would it be? If I open up my coordinates manager with this little option down here and I go over to size, you'll see, right, it's about 10 centimeters in diameter and 22 centimeters high, right? And that might even be like, that's kind of a tall wine glass, right? But it's based on a wine glass that I had and I measured. And if we were to go into solo mode just really quickly, I'm going to have this wine glass selected without the without anything else. So you can kind of see, right, that I have this wall thickness is really, really thin. And I did this just using hold on, let me see if I can turn some of these things off first, right? So I used the lathe tool, created a spline, made the wall thickness granted I couldn't really measure here at all very easily, but I did measure the top rim. I think it was like less than a millimeter or something. Rather than take the time to model this in this tutorial though, I just made it. So you could take a glass object that you have on hand, make the measurements, and do your thing, or if you're in the class, just use this file. So make something, make sure it's to scale, right? And the reason for that is, right, when light passes through something like glass warps the light, right? It bends light. And so if it's a really thick, like if I made this thing 200 centimeters tall, it's not going to look right because the light is going to be bending far more than it should, right? Because the wall thickness would be like, maybe at that scale, maybe it's like, I don't know, we'll just say 10 centimeters or something thick, or, thick enough that it's going to look really different from what it would look like if it was actually to scale. So that's step one, is make sure if you're modeling something to do this tutorial with, that you're doing it to scale. Okay, the other thing is that this was done in a view that was pre-Redshift. And so if you're using this file, you need to go up and under your render settings, you go to edit render settings. You can do that on this little button here. And the renderer was set to physical. We are going to change that to Redshift. So that's step one. Then we are going to go ahead and select the other parts that are going to need to be changed are our lights. And obviously, like, these materials will actually render in Redshift fine. But we're going to be creating new materials for the glass and for the wine and water and all of that in a little bit. But the other things that need to be changed are our lights and our camera. So if I select the top light and I go to the General tab on my light, you'll see it says Convert to Redshift. I'm going to go ahead and click that. And you're going to notice, right, it automatically changes the lighting situation in here, because when I do that conversion, it turns the light on, right? So if I turn this light off, right, it's going to go back to where we were at. Now I'm going to go to the softbox light, which is basically just an area light. And I'm going to go ahead and convert this to Redshift as well. The area light doesn't I mean, I would say it doesn't actually really change the lighting situation at all, which is fantastic. And then the camera as well, there's not an option to convert this to Redshift. It's just that the settings are different than the standard Redshift camera. So all we're going to do is we have the camera selected here. We are going to just click standard. And I don't know why. Oh, I have the wrong view selected, right? This is my current view that I have selected. So if I was to click up here for the my perspective view and then create a camera, it should be aligned exactly with where the other camera is, because this camera was what we were looking through already. So I'm just going to go ahead and switch to this. Now I could delete this camera from the scene because I'm not going to need that one any longer. Okay, so I've got those settings done. So then the other thing I want to do is I want to go to my wine glass objects, and I just want to delete the existing materials off of those. We're going to leave the backdrop materials there. And so this backdrop is just set up. It's basically, if I turn this off, it's one plane with two polygons. And let me see if I can zoom out on this view. I don't really want to reframe the glasses, but I will. Right, but it's basically a plane that had one segment in one direction. It's folded in half. I might have put more segments on here. I can't remember. Oh, okay. So yeah, there's three segments and four segments in one direction, three in the other, and basically made it editable, folded it, and then you put it in the subdivision surface, and that's going to round everything out pretty effectively, and it creates this seamless backdrop. And then the reason there's these three materials here is that you can switch the order. So if you wanted a gray backdrop instead of a white backdrop, you can do that. Or if you wanted like a black backdrop, you can do that as well. We're going to leave it at white. And these are all just like really flat materials. Okay, so we've got that set. I'm going to go ahead and reframe this camera just a little bit so that we are good to go. And I don't need all four views. I'm not going to be doing any additional modeling. It would be a good idea to go ahead and save this file at this point with those settings. And so if you are doing this, independently, hopefully you can follow those instructions for making the scene happen. So I'm just going to call this demo because I already have a mid one. Okay, so we've got our glasses and we've got our scene. So let's go ahead and create a new material. So we're just going to hit the plus sign because we're already in Redshift. It should automatically generate a default Redshift material. And I'm going to go ahead and put this material on the glass on the left side of my view. And I'm going to go ahead and turn Gerard shading off. I'm just going to say lines. Right, and you'll see that it's reflective there. Let's go ahead, and if you've been following my other tutorials, we have created a Redshift render view. This is going to be our final output, right? This is the glass that we're going to make. It looks like real glass. It's kind of awesome. And so we are going to, I'm going to go ahead and hit play here because, that'll update this. If you haven't been following, if you're just jumping in, you can go to the Redshift menu at the top of the screen and go down to Redshift Render View. You can also, under this middle render settings, you can say Redshift Render View there as well. And that'll open up a window, it'll be floating, and then you can connect it if you want to the main pane. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and reframe this just a touch more so we can see the whole glass. And right now, all I have, we'll go a little bit further away. There we go. Right now, all I have on in terms of lighting currently is the softbox. I might want to increase the exposure a little bit on this, and just a little bit. I'm going to say 0.3. Let's do 0.5. And so if those of you who are doing this from scratch, you can see that the intensity here is a lot. Just pause the video, look at that number, copy it. paste it. You can also look at the size of the thing here. I don't think under details there's anything that is different. I think that should all just be the same. Okay, so now let's go ahead and pop open our material view, and we don't even need to do nodes or anything for this demo. It's pretty simple. So step one, we don't want any base color whatsoever. We're going to set the weight to 0, right? Get this beautiful black glossy thing. We're going to set our roughness down. Let's leave it at 0.2 for now, and we'll set it down in a second. The index of refraction, IOR, 1.5 is the index of refraction for glass. There's different types of glass, and they vary slightly based on the mineral contents and variations. You can go look on a chart if you want to online. Just search index of refraction chart, and you'll find all sorts of items on there. But yeah, we're going to leave all of that alone. We're not going to make any changes there. And we're really going to be focusing on transmission and all the settings on transmission. So step one, let's go ahead and give this 100% or full 1 transmission. Now you'll notice, I haven't said anything about this, but there is liquid, quote unquote, in the glass right now. And so that's why this part's dark. It's not like an issue with the render settings. Okay, so we've made this clear. That's fantastic. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the Omni light, and I'm going to turn off the softbox because I do want to, right, we want to be looking at shadows as well. Like the hard shadows on this really help in terms of knowing what's going on. So we're going to do that. But again, we need to adjust our intensity. I'm going to set this, in this case, this light's pretty close to our objects. If I set my intensity to 2, and then if I boost my exposure to like 0.4, if you have the scene, this is about the lighting that we're looking for. Something else to note, when you are dealing with transparency, you don't want this object to be floating off the surface that you have it on. It needs to be basically against that surface or intersecting very, very slightly in order to get things to look right here. Otherwise, you'll have like a little air gap and it looks weird because the whole cup is essentially floating a tiny bit above that surface, and you get weird reflections and things happening underneath the glass. And so in this case, if I was to zoom in on the base, if you look, like most glasses, like wine glasses, there's actually a little bit of a cupping that happens in the middle here. So it does lift up a little bit in the center, but you can see on the edges here is where it's actually like touching that other object, that other material. Okay, so let's go back to our glass right, and you're going to see like right now it's been rendering for a while. You might note that this is taking a lot longer than, say, the metals, and that's because transmission is always going to be more expensive in terms of render time and in terms of render quality. That's why they have all these. If we go down to transmission, they're going to have samples as an option here, right? And usually to get the same quality, and by quality I mean no like little speckly noise, right? To get the same quality in a transparent material, you need more samples than you do in an opaque material. All right, we're going to leave it at 16 because the more samples you put on there, the longer it takes to render. And so no matter what, you want to work at a low number of samples for efficiency while you're testing things out. Once you're happy with it and you're going to do a final render for your scene, you can boost those. Like I would probably jump this up to 32 samples and see if I'm happy with that, and then go further if needed. Okay, so first, transmission color. We talked about this a little bit before. Oh, sorry, before transmission color. Note that this is really pretty hazy, and that's because the roughness on the reflection channel impacts, right, what this is going to look like. So we're going to set our roughness down, not to 0, but we'll just say 0.05. There we go, right? Now we have much more clear glass, right? That looks a lot more like actual glass. Now, we need to adjust our transmission color. So transmission color is going to affect the tint of the entire glass. So if I was to say, in our case, we're going to go with green, a greenish color, because a lot of glass tends to go green, right? Like it's clear, but it has like a greenish tint to it. And so if I, boost this up, it doesn't look like this is very green, right? It's barely green, but look at how much of an effect it has on the color of the glass, right? And if I go further over, it's going to even be, right, significantly more intense. Now, this is not really what we want. Also, if I go down darker, right, if I get close, it just basically goes black. Right now, this is pretty cool. There's materials and glass that does look like this, and so having the ability to set things like this is fantastic. But in our case, we're going to keep it right up at the top, and we're going to pull this over. And I just want you to see, like, right, this is about the color of the glass that we would want, but we don't want it to be the same uniform across the entire glass, right? Usually where the glass wall is thinner, we're not going to get any of this. And then where it's thicker, like down here at the base or in the stem, we're going to get more of a green color. So I have this currently set basically to, somewhat close to like the mid, like green. And it doesn't really matter. But the big thing is, right, my saturation is currently 10%. More or less. And so we might adjust that in a little bit, but that's going to be our starting point. So that sets color across. Obviously, weight is going to be whether or not this is transparent. Extra roughness means that what this allows you to do is it allows you to have a glossy exterior, but you can have a cloudy interior, right, in the glass. So if I was to increase the roughness a bit here, you'll see that I still have this like surface edge here, but it's added some roughness, and I'm not going to let this take its time to do its thing because we're not necessarily interested in this, but it gives you a lot more fine-tuned control. And right, roughness from reflection and extra roughness are both going to impact the roughness of the glass that we're working with, right? But this makes it look more cloudy or translucent. And it really looks more like it has this internally rather than it being something that's on the surface. So I'm going to set this back to 0 because for this example, we don't need that. You'll notice the samples are set to 8 here, and that's because, and I was talking about samples down here, but that's for the scatter anisotropy. We're not going to worry about that yet. But the samples here are 8 instead of 16, and that's just because it's so much more expensive to do glass. So now let's say, right, we want this to be thinner, to be more clear here, but not elsewhere. That's where depth comes in. With a depth of 0, basically it shuts depth off. It doesn't mean that there's no depth. It means that it is just off, right? So if I increased this to just 0.01, right, you're going to see that it gets a lot more vibrant, right? This means that the depth is really, really shallow. And what that means is the depth is like how much glass does it take for the tint to become apparent, right? And so a shallower depth means that basically it's going to be amplifying, right, that amount. And so what we need to do is we just need to click over until we get to a place where we're pretty happy. I would say 0.96 in this case might be a little bit light. I'm going to go with, we'll try 0.9. Right? And the reason this scale is so much bigger is because, right, obviously if we're using larger objects and if it's something that's has transmission, but maybe it's not glass, we want to be able to like have that depth happen over a much larger scale, especially for something like, say, like ocean water or something like that. So I'm going to say, let's go to 0.8. All right, and I'm just sort of stepping this through because I'd like there to be green there, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit so I can take a look at this. I do want you to note, right, that green is coming through and the same levels in the reflection, and I'm just going to cruise this down a little bit so we can really see where this is, you know, starting to affect the base. And I think 0.8 might be pretty good. It makes me think that maybe what I actually want to do though, and I love that this looks white, right? Because it's so narrow. I'm going to set my my saturation down even lower. I'm going to go to like 5% for my saturation. And then that looks more natural. But I'm going to go ahead and increase this depth now to, I'm going to go to 1 and just see what that looks like. Okay, actually that's the wrong direction, right? I'm going to go to 0.5 and see what that looks like. Okay, so by reducing my saturation on my color, but then like shortening the depth, I'm getting a bit more of a green tone in here, but it feels much more natural. And it feels more accurate to the actual glass that I have. I am going to say I do have it like set a little bit high right now, but I am trying to make it so it's, you know, perceptible as we do this tutorial. And we can always turn it down later. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and switch lights and just see what it looks like with this other light on. And the area light is going to be nice because we get these larger specular highlights from the actual, right, the shape of the light itself. But that's looking pretty good, right? It's a little blown out. I might want this light to be a little bit less intense. So I'm going to set my exposure to 0.2. There we go. That's probably a little bit better. Okay. So we've got this set. So let's look at some other settings in here that and kind of describe how they work and what they do. So the other things that we've got here is we've also got this scatter color. And what the scatter color does, it describes what happens when light goes through and hits the glass and scatters, right? There's imperfections, there's material in there, and light will, depending on how many imperfections are in the glass, light is going to scatter more or less. And so what this does is, so first, scatter will not work at all if we don't have any depth, right? So if depth was 0, scatter isn't changing these things, it will do nothing. And so what this does, and I'm going to do this in like a, let's just do a green. That way it'll at least look similar to what's happening with the glass. So what this means is, right, it's just, you can imagine it, right, like there's certain types of glass where it's colored, right, where you can kind of see through it, but really it's, you know, it's glass, but light isn't transmitting through it in the same way. Light is going in and bouncing around and then, right, exiting. And so the scatter color represents, you know, what happens if you have glass that is like that. Now the other thing setting here is the scatter anisotropy. And what this does is basically what this means is when light enters this object, should the light rays, when they bounce off, when they scatter off whatever's in this glass, should they more or less continue in the direction of that the light rays are going, or should more of them be bouncing back in the opposite direction, right? Because sometimes things will hit and they'll reflect. Other times they'll just kind of hit and bounce in a different angle, but still go more or less in the same direction. And so by default, it's at 0. If I make these values less than 1, what it's going to do is that means that there's more backscatter, right? The light is going to be bouncing the opposite direction, right? So the lights, we can tell the light's here, right? The light is hitting the surface, and then a lot more of it than less is bouncing towards the camera, right? And so if I increase this, it's going to continue to get more and more. And the only way I can really feel like I describe it is it gets milkier. And so if I keep going on this, right, it's going to eventually, right, look really strange. But there's, you know, kind of a sweet spot near zero. And I'm sure you've all seen something like fake jade or something where it's actually glass. And it's got this like kind of milky green texture. If I go the other direction, and start going in the positive direction, right, I'm still going to get a lot of scatter. And it's still going to be angling it. It's just going to be creating a different result. All right, this glass gets darker. It's almost like it's absorbing more light when it does this, because of the way the scatter intensity is, you know, it's not really passing through and doing things. It's like just going, you know, sideways and crazy and not really, not really doing it much. Right. So this is something where, you know, depending on the material, and also it really depends on what angle the light is at in relation to this. Again, if we go to the help menu, which I'm just right clicking on any word and hitting show help, right, and it says page not found. If I go to the Redshift renderer over here on the side, and I go down to shaders, or Redshift shaders, maybe that's what it says. Where is it? Oh, it's just shaders. And then I go to material shaders. And if I go to my standard material, and then I jump down to transmission, wherever that is. I have to wait for some images to load because the internet's going slow. I don't think. So again, this has like all sorts of very specific information and examples of what these different things do, right? Here's some of the things talking about depth, and the changes depth makes. Sorry, it's twitching all over. I'm just going to wait till this finishes. Oh my Lord. Oh my Lord. Okay, I think we've got it all now. So this is right where it talks about scatter color, transmission depth being set to 1, kind of gives you some examples of what these things look like. And this is where you can see the scatter, and they call it subsurface, but it's scatter, aka subsurface anisotropy. And you can see like if the light's in this direction, right, it's front lighting, and they kind of show you what the settings do and how that looks. And then if you go to the standard lighting, which I don't know what that even means, but it looks like it's kind of over here somewhere. But then if you have backlighting, right, you can kind of see how that's going to change what this looks like as well. So it's really great. It tells you a whole bunch of different things. Definitely take a look at that help menu. Okay, so and now that I've been doing that talking, we can actually see kind of the final result of this setting. So yeah, you can see it's a really gorgeous material, the way that everything works with this. Now that I've gotten there, I'm going to hit this to 0 because we don't actually want that as part of here. And I'm going to set my scatter color back to black, right? This is something where I don't need these things in the glass that I'm currently making. So the last item here is dispersion. And I didn't talk about this. I should have pointed you to this in the help menu. But dispersion is basically how does light bend and separate when it goes through a transparent material. This, at least with Redshift, compared to previous versions of previous render engines in Cinema 4D, this is a new setting, and this is pretty exciting and fantastic. And so the help menu says that for glass, you should start at 10, and diamonds are 70, right? Diamonds, basically, the bigger the number, the more the light is going to be separated into the color spectrum. And so if I do dispersion and I set this to 10, right, you'll see a change. It's really subtle. And we're going to turn off the soft box and turn on our other light, because we'll be able to see a little bit more clearly in some of the shadows and some of these other parts. And so what I want you to see is that as we go through this glass, if I get to, and I'm going to try and zoom in a little bit on this to make it even bigger and more obvious. Let's go ahead and see if we can set it up here. You're going to see that there's like a subtle, and this noise is actually helping us, right? But there's like a tiny subtle separation anywhere there's a edge here, where there's a change, where we'll see like a little bit of red, a little bit of blue, a little bit of green kind of peek out and blend in a different way, right? And it's really the whole spectrum, but that's what's doing that. And that dispersion, having that ability to add that, adds a significant amount of realism. It's subtle, but it's a significant amount of realism to our objects. And so, right, as this continues to go, right, we've probably all seen glass that looks just like this, right? This object is pretty remarkably photorealistic. And, right, I didn't even need to use a single node. I, barely had to adjust a few settings. Compared to how much work it took to create realistic glass in previous versions of cinema, this is just a huge, it's just a huge boon for us. It's really fantastic that Redshift makes it this easy to make a convincing glass. Okay. So with that, this section of the tutorial is done. We have made glass. So in the next, and just note, look at how green the preview is, right? So in the next section of the tutorial, we're going to take this gray fluid and we're going to make that into water and then into wine.